spooky place.
Sleep paralysis, where nightmares become reality. You wake up, unable to move, trapped in your own body, while something lurks in the darkness, watching, waiting. Is it just a trick of the mind, or are you truly not alone? Tonight, we bring you 5 terrifying sleep paralysis encounters that will make you question what really happens when you close your eyes. Listen closely, and whatever you do, don't fall asleep. The shadow at the foot of the bed. Lena had always been a light sleeper, but tonight was different. The kind of different that made her skin crawl and her heart race, even before she opened her eyes. It was the kind of night where the air itself felt wrong, thick, heavy, and tinged with a metallic tang that clung to the back of her throat. She woke abruptly, her eyes snapping open to the suffocating darkness of her bedroom. Her body refused to obey her, paralyzed as if an invisible weight pinned her to the mattress. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the oppressive stillness of the room. And then she saw it. At the foot of her bed stood a figure, tall, impossibly tall, its silhouette jagged and distorted, as though it were made of shadows that refused to conform to the laws of nature. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, too far to the left, then too far to the right, as if studying her. But the most horrifying part was its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where features should have been, there was only a void, a swirling, inky blackness that seemed to pull at the very light around it. Lena tried to scream, but her voice was trapped in her throat, her lips frozen in a silent plea. The room grew colder, the air so dense it felt like she was drowning. The figure didn't move, not at first. It simply stood there, its head tilting back and forth, as if savoring her terror. And then, without warning, it lunged. Lena felt the weight of it before she saw it move, a crushing pressure on her chest, as if the thing had materialized directly on top of her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare into that endless void where its face should have been. It leaned closer, until she could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that seeped in her bones and made her teeth chatter. She was going to die. She was sure of it. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. Lena gasped, bolting upright in bed, her chest heaving as she gulped in lungfuls of air. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the figure, but it was gone. The room was empty, silent, normal, except it wasn't. Her blankets were still indented, the fabric crumpled and twisted as if something heavy had been crouching there moments before. Lena's breath hitched, her mind racing. She told herself it was just sleep paralysis, a trick of the mind, anything but real. But deep down, she knew better. That thing, whatever it was, had been real, and it had been watching her. The next morning, Lena tried to shake off the lingering dread. She went about her day as usual, forcing herself to focus on work, on errands, on anything but the memory of that faceless figure. But as the hours passed, strange things began to happen. Her phone would ring, but when she answered, there was only static on the other end. Her reflection in the mirror seemed off, as if it were moving just a fraction of a second behind her. And then there were the whispers, faint, almost imperceptible, but there, always just at the edge of her hearing. By nightfall, Lena was exhausted, her nerves frayed. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that it was all in her head. But as she climbed into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding in her chest. Minutes passed, hours. Just as she was beginning to relax, she felt it. a cold breath on the back of her neck. She froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, ever so slowly, she turned her head to look over her shoulder. The figure was there, standing beside her bed, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, shadows shifted and writhed, forming into more figures, dozens of them, all faceless, all watching her. Lena's scream finally broke free, shattering the silence of the night. She scrambled out of bed, her legs tangling in the sheets as she stumbled toward the door. But the figures didn't move. They simply stood there, their void-like faces fixed on her, as if waiting for something. She yanked open the door and ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood floor. She didn't stop until she reached the living room, where she collapsed onto the couch, her chest heaving. She told herself she was safe, that the figures couldn't follow her. But as she sat there, clutching a blanket to her chest, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The shadows in the room were moving. They stretched and twisted, elongating into shapes that were almost human. And then, one by one, they began to step forward, emerging from the darkness. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. They had always been there, lurking in the corners of her world, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And now, they had her. The next morning, Lena's neighbor knocked on her door, concerned that she hadn't seen her in days. When there was no answer, she called the police. They found the apartment empty, the bed neatly made, the furniture untouched. There was no sign of Lena, no note, no clues, nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished. But if the officers had looked closer, they might have noticed the faint indentation on the bed, as if something heavy had been crouching there. And if they had stayed long enough, they might have felt the chill in the air, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you're being watched. Because Lena wasn't gone. Not really. She was still there, trapped in the shadows, her face now as blank and featureless as the things that had taken her. And if you listen closely, on quiet nights, you might hear her whispering, her voice joining the chorus of the lost, forever waiting for the next person to wake up in the dead of night and find themselves unable to move. As the days turned into weeks, the police closed Lena's case, labeling a missing persons file that would likely never be solved. Her apartment remained empty, a silent tomb of unanswered questions. But the shadows in her room never left. They lingered, growing darker, denser, as if feeding on the fear and despair that had seeped into the walls. Neighbors began to report strange occurrences, flickering lights, faint whispers echoing through the hallways, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. One by one, they moved out, leaving the building half empty, a hollow shell of what it once was. Then, one night, a new tenant moved into Lena's old apartment. Her name was Claire, and she was skeptical of the rumors. She didn't believe in ghosts or shadowy figures or things that went bump in the night. But as she lay in bed that first night, she felt it, a cold breath on her neck, a weight pressing down her chest. Her eyes flew open, and there it was, the faceless figure, its head tilting unnaturally, its void-like gaze fixed on her. Behind it, the shadows shifted, forming into more figures, their presence suffocating. Claire tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move, but her body was frozen. And as the figures closed in, she realized the horrifying truth. They weren't just shadows. They were people. People like Lena. People like her. The next morning, Claire's apartment was empty, just like Lena's had been. But if you were to walk past her door late at night, you might hear it, the faint sound of whispering, a chorus of voices pleading for help. And if you were brave enough to peek through the keyhole, you might see them, the faceless figures, their heads tilting in unison, their void-like faces turning toward you. Because they're always watching, always waiting, and sooner or later, they'll find you too. The whispering thing. John had always been a creature of habit. Every night, without fail, he would lock his door, draw the curtains tight, and ensure his room was a fortress against the outside world. It wasn't just a preference, it was a ritual and necessity. He couldn't sleep otherwise. The thought of an open door, even a crack, made his skin crawl. It was as if the darkness outside his room was alive, waiting to seep in. But that night, something was different. John woke abruptly, his body rigid, his breath caught in his throat. He tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey. Panic surged through him as he realized he was paralyzed. His eyes the only part of him that could function. They darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to explain the dread pooling in his chest. The room was pitch black, save for the faint sliver of moonlight slicing through the curtains. It illuminated the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to writhe and twist unnaturally. And then he heard it, a low, guttural whisper, so faint it could have been the wind, except there was no wind. The sound was coming from inside the room. It was unintelligible, a language that didn't belong to this world, each syllable dripping with malice. John's heart pounded as his eyes flicked toward the door. His breath hitched. It was open, just a crack, but enough to let the darkness spill in. He was certain he had shut it. He always shut it. The whispering grew louder, closer, crawling across the room like a living thing. John's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was he dreaming? Hallucinating? The air grew colder, and he could feel it now. Something was in the room with him. Something that shouldn't be. The whispers were right beside him now. So close he could feel the cold breath on his ear. It sent shivers down his spine, his skin prickling with goosebumps. He wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything. But he was frozen, helpless. And then he felt it. A wet, clawed hand pressed against his chest. The sensation was vile, the claws digging into his skin just enough to make him gasp in silent agony. The whispers grew frantic, almost excited, as if whatever was touching him was feeding off his fear. John's mind screamed at him to move, to fight, but his body was a prison. The hand lingered for what felt like an eternity before finally pulling away. And just like that, the paralysis broke. John bolted upright, gasping for air, his chest heaving as if he'd been drowning. His eyes shot to the door, expecting to be closed, expecting to wake up and realize it had all been a nightmare. But it wasn't. The door was still open, the darkness beyond it swirling like a living entity. He scrambled out of bed, slamming the door shut and locking it with trembling hands. He leaned against it, his breath coming in ragged bursts, trying to convince himself it was over. But it wasn't. The whispers started again, this time from behind him. John turned slowly, his heart pounding in his ears. The room was empty, but the whispers were louder now, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, as if the house had come alive. He backed away from the door, his eyes darting around the room. And then he saw it, in a corner where the shadows had been writhing earlier. Something was taking shape. It was faint at first, like a trick of the light, but it grew more solid with every passing second. A figure, hunched and grotesque, its limbs too long, its fingers ending in sharp, wet claws. Its face was a blur, shifting and twisting as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. But its eyes, those were clear, glowing, malevolent slits that locked onto John with a hunger that made his blood run cold. The whispers became a chorus, echoing in his mind, filling every corner of the room. John stumbled backward, his back hitting the door. He fumbled with the lock, desperate to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. The figure began to move, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. It crawled toward him, its claws scraping against the floor, leaving deep gouges in the wood. John's mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. The windows were too high, the door was sealed, and the thing was getting closer. He could smell it now, a sickening mix of rot and damp earth. The whispers were deafening, drowning out his thoughts, his screams. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. But then, just as the creature was within arm's reach, everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The room fell silent. John opened his eyes, half expecting to see the creature looming over him, but it was gone. The room was empty, the door still shut. He let out a shaky breath, his legs giving out as he slid to the floor. It was over. It had to be over. But as he sat there, trying to calm his racing heart, he noticed something on the floor. A trail of wet, clawed footprints leading from the corner to where he now sat. And then he felt it, a cold breath on the back of his neck, followed by a whisper, so faint he almost missed it. "You left the door open." John's blood turned to ice. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, the door still shut. But as he stared at it, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The lock was on the inside, and it was unlocked. The next morning, John's neighbors found his door wide open. The house was empty, as if he had vanished into thin air. The only clue was a single wet, clawed handprint on the inside of the door, and a faint whisper that seemed to linger in the air, just loud enough to send a chill down their spines. The door is open, and somewhere, in the darkness, John realized the truth. It had never been about keeping the door closed. It had been about keeping it out. But now, the door was open, and it was inside. John's disappearance became the talk of the town, but no one could explain it. The police searched his house, finding nothing out of the ordinary, except for the clawed handprint on the door. It defied logic, as if it had been burned into the wood. The neighbors whispered among themselves, some claiming they had heard faint, guttural sounds coming from John's house late at night, even after he was gone. Others swore they saw shadows moving behind the curtains, though the house was supposed to be empty. The case grew cold, but the unease lingered, like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Years later, a new family moved into the house, unaware of its dark history. They laughed at the rumors, dismissing them as small-town superstition. But on their first night, their youngest child, a girl of 6, woke up screaming. She claimed a shadow man had been standing in the corner of her room, whispering something she couldn't understand. Her parents checked the room, finding nothing, but the girl refused to sleep there again. The next morning, they noticed something strange. The door to her room, which they had firmly shut the night before, was slightly ajar, and on the floor, just inside the threshold, was a single wet footprint, clawed and grotesque. The family moved out within the week, but the house remained, its door forever open, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its threshold. And in the darkness, the whispers grew louder, hungrier. The door was open, and it was no longer content to wait. It was coming, for everyone. The woman in the mirror. Samantha had always been a light sleeper, her nights often punctuated by fleeting moments of sleep paralysis. Those brief episodes, though terrifying, were nothing more than a few seconds of immobility, a fleeting sense of dread, and then release. But that night was different. That night, the paralysis didn't end. It stretched on, wrapping her in a cold, suffocating embrace. Her bedroom was bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. The mirror across from her bed, an antique she had inherited from her grandmother, stood like a silent sentinel. It was an ornate thing, its frame carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe if you stared at them too long. Samantha had always found it unsettling, but she kept it out of a sense of obligation. After all, it was a family heirloom. As she lay there, trapped in her own body, her eyes locked onto the mirror, she could see herself reflected in its surface. Her pale face, her wide, terrified eyes, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. But something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't mirroring her. It was grinning, a slow, malevolent grin that spread across its face like a crack in ice. Samantha's breath hitched, her mind screaming at her to look away, but she couldn't. Her reflection's head tilted to the side in a jerky, unnatural motion, its neck bending at an impossible angle. Then it sat up. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum in her ears. Her reflection raised a hand, its fingers curling in a grotesque imitation of a wave. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if it were savoring her terror. And then it began to crawl. The reflection dragged itself forward, its hands pressing against the glass, as if testing its boundaries. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and Samantha's breath caught in her throat. The reflection's fingers curled over the edge of the frame, and then its head emerged, followed by its shoulders. It was crawling out of the mirror, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. Samantha's mind screamed at her to move, to run, to do anything, but her body refused to obey. She could only watch in horror as the thing that wore her face dragged itself closer, its grin widening every inch it gained. The air grew colder, the room darker, as if the very light was being sucked into the void of its presence. Finally, just as the reflection's hand reached out to touch her, Samantha's body jerked free of the paralysis. She screamed, a raw, guttural sound that shattered the silence of the night. With a desperate lunge, she flipped the mirror over, its frame slamming against the floor with a loud crash. She scrambled back, her chest heaving, her eyes fixed on the overturned mirror, as if expecting it to move again. But it didn't. The room was silent, the moonlight once again casting its gentle glow. Samantha sat there for what felt like hours, her mind racing, her body trembling. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, she woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it had all been a nightmare, a particularly vivid hallucination brought on by stress. But then she saw the mirror. It was still lying face down on the floor, just as she had left it. But something was different. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive, as if it were radiating a malevolent energy. Swallowing her fear, Samantha reached out and flipped it over. Her breath caught in her throat. The glass was smeared with handprints. Not just any handprints, her handprints, but they were on the wrong side of the glass, as if something had been trying to get out. Samantha's mind raced. She had to get rid of the mirror. She couldn't keep it in her house any longer. But as she reached for it, a cold dread settled over her. The handprints were fresh, the glass still smudged as if they had been made moments ago. And then she noticed something else. The reflection in the mirror wasn't hers. It was still grinning. Before she could react, the reflection lunged forward, its hand shooting out of the mirror and grabbing her wrist. The grip was icy, unyielding, and Samantha felt herself being pulled forward toward the glass. She screamed, clawing at the floor, but the reflection was too strong. Her hand passed through the surface of the mirror as if it were water, and then her arm, her shoulder, her head. The last thing she saw before she was dragged completely into the mirror was her own face, staring back at her from the other side, its grin wider than ever. Days passed, and Samantha's absence was noted by her friends and co-workers. Concerned, they went to her apartment, only to find it empty. The mirror still stood in her bedroom, its surface pristine, reflecting nothing but the empty room. But if you looked closely, if you stared into the glass for just a little too long, you might see something. A flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. And if you were very, very quiet, you might hear it, a faint, muffled scream, coming from somewhere deep within the mirror. And if you were foolish enough to touch the glass, you might feel it, a cold, unyielding grip pulling you in, because the mirror was hungry, and it was waiting. Samantha's disappearance left a void in the lives of those who knew her, but the mirror remained, untouched and undisturbed, in her empty apartment. Weeks turned into months, and the landlord, eager to rent out the space again, decided to clear out her belongings. The mirror, with its ornate frame and unsettling aura, was boxed up and sold at an estate sale to an unsuspecting couple, Mark and Lisa, who were drawn to its antique charm. They placed it in their living room, unaware of the darkness it carried. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The mirror hung elegantly on their wall, reflecting the cozy room and its inhabitants. But soon, Lisa began to notice strange things. Flickers of movement in the corner of her eye, whispers when no one was around, and a chilling sensation whenever she passed the mirror. Mark dismissed her concerns, chalking it up to stress. But one night, as Lisa stood in front of the mirror brushing her hair, she froze. Her reflection had stopped moving. It stared back at her, its expression blank, its eyes hollow. Before she could react, it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass, as if testing the barrier between worlds. Lisa screamed, dropping the brush and stumbling backward. When she looked again, the reflection was normal, mimicking her every move. But the fear lingered, gnawing at her sanity. One stormy night, Mark woke to the sound of Lisa's voice coming from the living room. He found her standing in front of the mirror, her back to him, her shoulders trembling. "Lisa," he called, but she didn't respond. As he approached, he noticed something horrifying. The reflection in the mirror wasn't Lisa's. It was Samantha's, her face twisted into that same malevolent grin, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Before Mark could react, Lisa turned around, her own face now a perfect replica of Samantha's. She lunged at him, her hands cold and unyielding, her strength inhuman. Mark fought back, but it was no use. Lisa, or whatever was wearing her face, dragged him toward the mirror. The surface rippled like water as his body was pulled through, his screams echoing before being abruptly silenced. The next morning, the living room was empty. The mirror hung undisturbed, its surface pristine. But if you looked closely, you might see two figures standing side by side in its depths, their faces frozen in eternal grins. And if you listen carefully, you might hear faint whispers, beckoning you closer, inviting you to join them. Because the mirror was never just a mirror. It was a gateway, a prison, and a predator. And it was always hungry. The man with no eyes. Nate had always been a prisoner of his own mind. For years, sleep paralysis had been his nightly tormentor, a cruel game where his body betrayed him, leaving him trapped in the liminal space between dreams and reality. But tonight was different. Tonight, the rules had changed. It began as it always did, a sudden awakening, his body frozen, his breath shallow. The dim glow of the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains, casting long, jagged shadows across his bedroom. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the room itself was holding its breath. And then he saw him. A man stood beside the bed, tall and gaunt, his silhouette unnaturally still. His face was a grotesque caricature of humanity, a crooked grin stretched too wide, too sharp, like a wound carved into his flesh. But it was his eyes, or rather, the absence of them, that made Nate's blood run cold. Empty sockets, black voids that seemed to drink in the light, leaving nothing but an abyss. The man leaned closer, his breath a foul stench of decay, and whispered, "You're not awake yet." Nate's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat of terror. He tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, he jolted upright, or so he thought. His body was still paralyzed, still trapped. The man was now inches from his face, his grin widening impossibly further. "You're not awake yet," the man repeated, his voice a guttural rasp. "But you will be soon." The room began to shift, the walls warping and twisting as if they were alive. The shadows deepened, stretching toward Nate like grasping hands. The man's form flickered, his edges blurring, as if he were a projection on a crumbling screen. And then he reached out, a skeletal hand, cold and dry, brushing against Nate's cheek. Nate's vision blurred, the room dissolving into a swirl of darkness and light. When it cleared, he was no longer in his bedroom. He was standing in a long, narrow hallway, the walls lined with doors. Each door was identical, save for a small, rusted number plate. The air was damp, the floor slick with something that glistened in the faint, flickering light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The man was gone, but his voice echoed in Nate's mind. "Find the right door, Nate, or you'll never wake up." Nate's paralysis was gone, but the fear remained, a heavy weight pressing down on him. He took a hesitant step forward, the floor squelching beneath his feet. The first door he approached was marked with a number 7. He reached for the handle, but before he could turn it, a low, guttural growl emanated from behind the door. He jerked his hand back, his breath catching in his throat. The second door, marked 13, was no better. As he drew near, the door rattled violently, as if something on the other side was desperate to get out. Nate backed away, his heart racing. The third door, marked 23, was silent. He hesitated, then turned the handle. The door opened to reveal a room that was both familiar and alien. It was his childhood bedroom, but everything was wrong. The walls were covered in a thick, pulsating black mold, and the air was thick with the stench of rot. In the corner, a figure sat hunched over, its back to him. It was small, childlike, but its movements were jerky, unnatural. "Nate," the figure whispered, its voice high-pitched and distorted. "You shouldn't be here." Nate's breath hitched. He knew that voice. It was his own, but from a time long forgotten. The figure began to turn, its movements slow and deliberate. Nate didn't wait to see its face. He slammed the door shut, his hands trembling. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the doors multiplying as he walked. Each one held a new horror, a new memory twisted into something monstrous. Door 42 opened to a room filled with mirrors, each reflecting a version of Nate that was more grotesque than the last. Door 66 revealed a vast, empty void where the man with the hollow eyes waited, his grin wider than ever. "You're running out of time, Nate," the man taunted, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "The right door is here, but can you find it before it's too late?" Nate's legs felt like lead, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He stumbled forward, his eyes darting from door to door, and then he saw it. A door marked with a symbol he didn't recognize, a twisted, spiraling shape that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. He reached for the handle, his hand shaking. As he turned it, the hallway began to collapse around him, the walls crumbling into nothingness. The door opened, and he was pulled inside. The room was small, dimly lit, and filled with the sound of ticking clocks. In the center stood a figure, cloaked in shadows. It turned to face him, and Nate's breath caught in his throat. It was himself, but older, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes filled with a deep, unending sorrow. "You're not awake yet," the figure said, its voice a haunting echo of his own. "But you will be, and when you are, you'll wish you weren't." Nate woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. He was back in his bedroom, the street lamp casting its familiar glow through the curtains. He sat up, his heart still racing, and looked around. The room was empty. The man was gone, but as he lay back down, trying to calm his frayed nerves, he noticed something on the floor beside his bed. A small, rusted number plate, marked with the same spiraling symbol he had seen on the door. And then, from the shadows, a voice whispered, "You're not awake yet." Nate's blood turned to ice. He wasn't sure if he ever would be. Nate's breath quickened as he stared at the rusted number plate, his mind racing. The symbol seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, and the air in the room grew colder, heavier. He reached down to pick it up, but the moment his fingers brushed against it, a searing pain shot through his hand. He yanked it back, only to see the symbol now burned into his palm, glowing faintly like a brand. The voice came again, louder this time, echoing from every corner of the room. "You're not awake yet, Nate, but you're so close." Before he could react, the walls of his bedroom began to peel away, revealing the same endless hallway from before. The doors were back, each one vibrating with a low, ominous hum. The man with the hollow eyes stood at the far end of the hall, his grin now stretching ear to ear, his skeletal hands beckoning. "Come, Nate," he crooned. "You've almost found it. The door to the real world. But be careful. Once you step through, there's no going back." Nate's legs moved on their own, carrying him down the hallway as the doors began to slam open and shut around him. Behind each one, he caught glimpses of horrors he couldn't fully comprehend. A room filled with writhing, faceless bodies. A void where time itself seemed to unravel. A mirror that showed not his reflection, but the man with the hollow eyes, staring back at him with a knowing smirk. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, he reached the end. There, standing alone, was a door marked with the same spiraling symbol burned into his palm. The man stepped aside, his grin widening impossibly. "This is it, Nate. The door to your freedom. Or is it your prison? Only one way to find out." Nate hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. He thought of his life, his struggles, the endless nights of paralysis and terror. Was this his chance to escape it all? Or was it another trick, another layer of the nightmare? With a deep breath, he turned the handle and stepped through. The world dissolved into blinding light. When his vision cleared, he was standing in his bedroom again. The street lamp outside cast its familiar glow, and the room was silent. He looked down at his hand. The symbol was gone. Relief flooded through him. It was over. He was awake, but then he noticed something. The room was too quiet. No hum of the refrigerator downstairs. No distant sound of cars on the street. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. The world outside was empty. No cars, no people, no movement. Just an endless, silent void stretching as far as he could see. And then he felt it, a presence behind him. He turned slowly, his heart pounding. The man with the hollow eyes stood in the corner of the room, his grin now a grotesque, jagged slash across his face. "You're awake now, Nate," he whispered. "But you're not alone. You never will be." Nate's scream caught in his throat as the man lunged forward, his hollow eyes swallowing the light, his laughter echoing in the emptiness. And as the darkness closed in, Nate realized the horrifying truth. He had never left the hallway. He had simply found the door to a deeper layer of the nightmare. And this time, there was no waking up. The crawling horror. Emma woke to the sound of skittering. It was a faint, almost imperceptible noise, like the scratch of insect legs against wood. Her eyes fluttered open, but her body refused to move. Sleep paralysis had her in its cold, unyielding grip. She lay there, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her ears. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the moon slipping through the cracks in her curtains. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and shifting like living things. And then she saw it. From the darkness of her ceiling, something began to descend. At first, it was just a shape, a human-like figure, but wrong, so wrong. Its limbs bent in ways that defied anatomy, its joints clicking and popping as it moved. It crawled on all fours, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its too wide mouth stretched into a grin that seemed to split its face in two. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, two pinpricks of malevolent glee. Emma tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move, to thrash, to do anything, but her body was a prison. The creature moved closer, its fingers tapping lightly against the wall as it descended. The sound was rhythmic, almost playful, like a child's game. But there was nothing playful about the way it looked at her, its gaze piercing through her very soul. Then it spoke. Its voice was a guttural whisper, like the rustle of dead leaves in a graveyard. "You see me now," it said, its grin widening impossibly further. "But I've seen you every night." Emma's breath hitched. Every night. How long had this thing been watching her? How long had it been lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to notice it? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible, but the creature gave her no time to think. It crawled down the wall and on her bed, its weight pressing down on the mattress. Emma could feel the cold radiating from its body as it lowered itself onto her chest. Its fingers, long and spindly, brushed against her cheeks, leaving trails of icy dread in their wake. Its breath smelled of decay, of things long dead and forgotten. "You've always been mine," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "You just didn't know it yet." And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone. The weight lifted from her chest, the cold receded, and Emma could move again. She sat up, gasping for air, her eyes darting around the room. But there was nothing there. No creature, no skittering, no tapping fingers. Just the silence of the night. She told herself it was a dream, a nightmare brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But deep down, she knew better. The creature's words echoed in her mind, a haunting refrain she couldn't shake. "I've seen you every night." The next day, Emma tried to go about her life as if nothing had happened. She went to work, she met friends for coffee, she even managed to laugh at a joke. But the creature's face lingered in her thoughts, its grin etched into her memory. That night, she left the lights on, hoping the brightness would keep the shadows at bay. But it didn't. She woke again to the sound of skittering. This time, she wasn't paralyzed. She sat up, her eyes scanning the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The creature was there, perched on the ceiling like a grotesque spider, its head tilted at that unnatural angle. "You can't escape me," it hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl. "I've been with you since the beginning." Emma's blood ran cold. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The creature's grin widened, its teeth glinting like shards of glass. "Everything." It lunged at her, and Emma screamed. She scrambled out of bed, her legs tangling in the sheets as she tried to flee. But the creature was faster. It grabbed her by the ankle, its grip like iron, and dragged her back. She kicked and thrashed, but it was no use. The creature was too strong. "You belong to me," it whispered, its breath hot against her ear. "You always have." And then, just as suddenly as before, it was gone. Emma lay on the floor, her body trembling, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do, where to turn. The creature's words haunted her, a constant reminder that she was never alone. The next day, Emma decided to seek help. She went to a therapist, a kind woman with a gentle smile and a soothing voice. Emma told her everything: the skittering, the paralysis, the creature with the too wide grin. The therapist listened patiently, nodding along as Emma spoke. "It sounds like you've been experiencing sleep paralysis," the therapist said. "It's a common phenomenon, often accompanied by hallucinations. The creature you saw is likely a manifestation of your subconscious fears." Emma wanted to believe her. She really did. But deep down, she knew the truth. The creature wasn't a hallucination. It was real, and it wasn't going to let her go. That night, Emma decided to take matters into her own hands. She set up a camera in her room, determined to catch the creature on film. She needed proof, something to show the world that she wasn't crazy. She went to bed, the camera's red light blinking in the darkness, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. The skittering started again, louder this time, more insistent. Emma's heart raced as she watched the creature descend from the ceiling, its limbs bending and twisting in impossible ways. It crawled toward her, its grin widening as it approached. "You can't escape me," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural growl. "I've been with you since the beginning." Emma reached for the camera, her fingers trembling as she pressed the button to stop the recording. She had proof now. She had caught the creature on film. But as she played back the footage, her blood ran cold. The camera had captured nothing but darkness. No creature, no skittering, no tapping fingers. Just the empty room, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. Emma's heart sank. The creature was real, but it didn't exist in the physical world. It existed in the shadows, in the spaces between reality and nightmare. And it wasn't going to let her go. The next night, Emma didn't bother with the camera. She knew it was pointless. The creature was there, waiting for her, its grin as wide as ever. "You belong to me," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You always have." And this time, Emma didn't fight. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. Months later, a new tenant moved into Emma's apartment. She was a young woman, full of life and laughter, with no idea of the horrors that lurked in the shadows. On her first night, she woke to the sound of skittering. From the darkness of her ceiling, something descended, a human-like figure, crawling on all fours, its limbs bending the wrong way. Its mouth was too wide, stretching into a sickening grin. And then it spoke. "You see me now," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "But I've seen you every night." The cycle had begun again. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.